He always sings raggedy music to the cattle as he swings back and forward in the saddle on a horse, a pretty good horse that's syncopated, gated. There's such a fun to meter to the roar of his repeater, how they run when they hear this fella's gun, because the western folks all know why he's a highfalutin, scootin', shootin' son of a gun from Arizona, ragtime.
One Tough Scout was put together by my dad, W. Cleon Skousen. So there's some fun genealogy in here. Royal, whose name was always shortened to Roy, was one tough scout. His father, Willard Skousen, was a contractor and built roads using horses and mules to smooth the dirt. Willard had a new contract to build a road in Mexico and tried to save money by dividing his resources. So he sent the equipment on ahead on the train, but he thought all the work animals, he would go ahead and send them on foot around the mountains, and his son Roy would be the one in charge. So he had a great deal of confidence in his son. Roy was 18 years old when they started this trip from Baja California across the uncharted Sierra Madre Mountains. Traveling with him was his brother Alonzo, who was 16 years old, and 3 or 4 Mexicans. Their job was to safely lead a herd of horses and pack mules to their new job site. Now, Roy had 2 favorite mottos in his life. Make your word as good as your bond. When you start a job, finish it. So, the story of one tough scout. The following are excerpts from the personal account of this 18-year-old Mormon boy, Royal Pratt Skousen. It took about 3 weeks to get a big pack outfit ready for such a long trip. We were told that white men had never tried packing a pack train across these mountains before. Well, finally, by August 9th, we were ready to start. All of our stock and supplies were assembled on the west bank of the Yaqui River. But due to heavy rains in the mountains, the river had spread out a half a mile wide. Sport and I were to lead the way into the river so that the horses and the other mules would all follow. Now, Sport was a sorrel horse, my horse, weighing in at about 1,300 pounds. He was tops wherever you wanted to use him, and I thought he was the best horse in the world. With a prayer in my heart, we plunged into the muddy waters 3/4 of a mile upstream from the landing on the other side. Most of the horses and mules followed Sport, but some were stubborn. When Sport and I reached midstream, a large pine log struck Sport and knocked him backwards. We both went down, and I made the mistake of releasing my hold of his mane. The waves were several feet high. I no sooner came up than a wave covered me over again. The next time I came up, I saw a large pine log floating nearby. It didn't take long to get on that, as I had taken quite a bit of water. It's in pretty bad shape. But as soon as I was able, I took to the water and started swimming toward the east bank, reaching shore about 2.5 miles below the landing. By the time I had worked my way back up the river to the landing, I was bleeding all over from the cuts, from the sharp leaves, from the bamboo cane that was in the jungle that lined the banks of the river there. All was excitement when I reached the landing, as they thought I had drowned. When Sport came in without me. Where's Roy? By mid-afternoon of the second day, we were climbing the foothills and could look down over the great Yaqui Valley and its jungles. The view reminded me of the great velvet rug spread about almost as far as the eye could see, fanning away to the west as it touched the sea. Before we reached the summit of the first high range of mountains, we realized that this was going to be a much more difficult trip than we had anticipated. It took us 4 days to go 30 miles through the heavy brush. We had to have a gang of men going ahead, cutting out the underbrush sufficiently wide for the pack animals so they would not scrub and tear their packs all to pieces. It took 12 days to reach the top of the first range of mountains. August and September are the rainy months in the Sierra Madre Mountains. After we reached the first range, it rained every afternoon as we were climbing the second range of mountains through heavy brush and working our way around cliffs and ledges. A gentle rain set in. Fog and heavy clouds settled down on us, and for the next 8 or 10 days, we never got to see the sun. At night, we would build a large pine log fire, stretch our water-soaked tents, and cook what little we could for supper. And then when bedtime came, we would help each other wring out the water of our blankets, get them steaming hot, then roll up in them and go to sleep. The roar of the lion and the cry of the panther would sometimes wake us up. We would reach out and make sure our guns were close by. We were in hunter's paradise. Deer, wild turkey, sage hens, wild pigeons, bear, lions, and panthers could be seen every day as we traveled along. We really feasted on wild game. A fine venison steak with Alonzo's hot baking powder bread right out of the Dutch oven made us a real treat. A few days after the heavy rain set in, I had to spend all my time shoeing horses and mules. The hooves had become soft, and the big horses would pull off their shoes, floundering over the rocky trails. I carried my tools with me on my saddle, and at noon and night, I would immediately start shoeing the animals that had become tender-footed. After supper, we would use the light of the big campfires to finish up that work. Some of our Spanish mules had never been shod, and they would have to be thrown down and tied, their front feet to one pine tree and their hind feet to another pine tree to get those shoes on. All the rivers we crossed during the next 30 days were at flood stage, which meant that they were anywhere from 200 to 800 feet wide. They'd spread out. Our supplies were sent across on rafts, which we made by cutting down some pine trees and using 8 25-foot logs all tied together. At these crossings, I would take off my clothes, jump on Old Sport, and lead the way. Sometimes we would drop in all over, but I would just hold tight to his mane, and up he would come and take me safely to the other side. At one crossing, which was only about 4 feet deep, we tried to take the stock across without unpacking them. However, 3 of the mules lost their footing and were killed as they were swept downstream about 1,000 feet and then went over 150-foot wall. It had been now 40 days since we left the coast, and we were virtually imprisoned in the heat of these mountains. The loss of the 3 mules packed with priceless food was discouraging as our supplies were running low. It seemed as though each high range of mountains would be the last, and that we would see some lower country. The range just ahead of us appeared to be impossible to climb. We stayed on a river in the canyon 4 days while scouting parties hunted a passageway. After 2 days' work with pick and bars, we managed to make a trail close along the high cliffs and ledges. Even so, the trail was so narrow that the pack animals could barely squeeze by. Our best pack mule was crowded off the trail by the other animals at one of the worst places and fell down over the cliff 300 or 400 feet. There was nothing we could do except make certain he was dead. So I shot him 3 or 4 times. He was packed with 100 pounds of flour, 50 pounds of salt, and a lot of canned fruit. The stuff was strewn all down the cliff, and it was impossible to get it. Instead of finding lower mountains when we reached the summit, there stood before our eyes an even higher range with cliffs and ledges 300 to 1,500 feet high and reaching as far as we could see in both directions. With our food supplies running so low, I can well remember how sick it made me feel. In later years, when I visited the Grand Canyon in Arizona, I thought to myself, this is the only mountain country in the United States that looks anything like the Sierra Madre Mountains of old Mexico. At least when we did finally reach the summit of the very highest range, we broke into shouts of joy as we saw much lower mountains ahead of us. It was now 2 months since we had left the coast. We had been forced to pool our supplies and each day rationed them out. We had used up all the horseshoe nails and shoes. When we started, we had, in addition to a lot of tough little Spanish mules, 25 head of fine horses. All of them were matched teams. Now we only had 3 of these horses left. I had been forced to kill the rest when they bruised their feet and got what is called the rot hoof. As we got out of the mountains, we had hoped to travel faster, but it was impossible on account of the tender-footed stock. By the time we reached lower country, I dropped behind with my 3 horses, who were so lame they could not keep up with the party. After traveling along slowly for 3 days, sleeping in my saddle, blankets, and listening to the pitiful groans of those poor animals, I could not make up my mind to kill them. I still hoped to find some ranch where I could leave them. They would look up to me as if to say, "Please do something to stop this pain." I finally decided to wait only 1 more day. If at the end of 1 more day's traveling I had not found a ranch, I determined to kill them or leave them where there was plenty of grass and water. But when morning came, one of the horses could not travel. It was my faithful and devoted friend Sport. With tears rolling down my face, I pulled the trigger that ended the life of the greatest horse I ever owned. I knelt down by his quivering body and stroked his head and mane. As life was leaving this noble creature, he had never failed me. In those treacherous waters, in those deep canyons, a great friend and a faithful servant had gone to his rest. Then I mounted my saddle horse and started out with the only 2 prize horses that remained out of the original 25. I turned in the saddle to get one last look at Sport. There he lay, in a soft grassy spot shaded by cedar and scrub pine, peacefully resting from his life's work that had been so nobly done. Late that afternoon, I found a small ranch in the center of a beautiful cedar valley, and there I left my other 2 lame horses. It took 2 days hard riding to bring me up to the main company again. A short time later, a rescue party found us. When we had been gone 2 months, Father and the other contractors had sent out a search party, but they had returned to Durango without finding a trace of us. After 2 weeks, they were successful. We had just finished our noon rations when they came riding into camp. It was a glorious day for us, and we didn't attempt to go any further that day. They had brought 4 mules loaded with food, so we cooked ourselves a big meal and listened to all the news from the outside world. We were a hard-looking bunch when Orr and his party found us. No food, our best horses all dead, the rest lame and hardly able to walk, our clothes in rags. We made slow progress on down to the city of Durango. George Orr was as wild and rough as they come. Not content to smoke, chew tobacco, and drink whiskey himself, he had tried many times while we were building the railroad on the Yaqui River to get me to smoke. Well, chew, drink with him, or he would pick out a little Mexican girl for my companion, saying, "Now, you've got to do these things. Show people you're a man. Don't be a sissy." But he had no luck. As we were traveling toward the city of Durango, he remarked to one of the boys that he would make me chew tobacco before we arrived in Durango. The next day, as we stopped for lunch, I unsaddled my horse, took off my belt and my 6-shooters, spur and chaps. Watching his chance, George slipped up behind me, threw both arms around me, and down I went, with him astraddle of me. Out came his last plug of chewing tobacco as he said, "Now, you little devil, you're going to take a chew. I'm going to make a man out of you yet." I was in a tough spot. I said, "Well, George, it looks like you're going to win at last, and I'm going to have to chew some of that dirty stuff that even a hog wouldn't eat. But let me up so I can take a good big bite. You know, that tobacco juice would choke me to death." He let me up, saying, "Now, no monkey business," and handed me the tobacco. I got ready to take a big bite with my mouth wide open. Just then, I motioned quickly towards some of the men and said, "Hey, Jones got kicked by that mule." George turned to look, and I was gone like a flash. George started after me, shouting, "Stop, stop, or I'll kill you!" He fired at me several times, but I made it to a small canyon nearby and threw his last plug of tobacco as far as I could throw it. George had lost sight of me, so I returned to camp before he did, and I picked up my 2 6-shooters. As George came back into camp, cursing and swearing at me, I fired a shot just to the right of his foot. "Now, don't do that," he said. "I was just joking." I fired another shot on the other side of his feet, and I said, "George, start dancing. I'll teach you to be a man." George began hopping and dancing and swearing and pleading as I peppered the ground with shots Finally, when he was all out of breath, I stopped. He was more respectful of me after that happened. But he suffered a lot before he got another plug of tobacco. I would ride alongside of him now and then and say, "Well, George, how are you feeling?" The answer was always the same: "Shut up." It was a great day when we finally came into headquarters just south of the city of Durango. All hope of our being alive had long since been abandoned, as everyone thought we had been killed by the Yaqui Indians. Thus concluded an unusual and exciting adventure for this 18-year-old boy. It was scouting in its toughest and most challenging and rugged form. It was scouting in real life. This boy had to be tough to come through alive, and ever since I first heard of him, I have always had the greatest affection and respect for him. He was my grandfather, Royal Pratt Skousen.
Why, he's a shooting, a highfalutin, a tootin' son of a gun from Arizona, ragtime cowboy Joe.